again, but right now we continue with Airtalk looking at COVID-19 and what a religious exemption looks like to vaccination. As you might be aware, for people who work in jobs where there is a vaccine mandate, they typically can apply for a religious exemption. What is that? What do they have to show as a part of that? Joining us to talk about it is attorney Angela Reddock-Wright, who was an employment attorney and mediator. Her Los Angeles-based law firm is Reddock Law Group. Angela, it's good to have you with us again on Airtalk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the theological aspects of this, what does the law say about how a religious exemption is even determined?
So the law provides for two exceptions for employers that are considering mandating or have already mandated the COVID vaccine in the workplace. One, an employee can request an exemption based on medical reasons or a disability, or based on what we call sincerely held religious belief. And in either of those instances, the employer has to engage in what we call the interactive process, which is a process between the employer and the employee, where the employee collects information and data to determine, if it can provide a reasonable accommodation to the employee, and if that request for a reasonable accommodation or for an exemption is based on legitimate reasons and that the employee has provided adequate support for the exemption.
And would that adequate support, is that defined in any way? Would that have to be the employee shows a faith tradition where there has been advice about a particular issue like vaccination, or is this something that an individual can just say, no, this has long been my deeply held belief, and because my faith involves personal agency and not the government telling me what to do, therefore it's religious? I mean, what does the law get into slicing and dicing that?
Right. Well, this is a relatively new area, not area of law, but an area of process and practice for most employers. While the religious exemption has been written into the law for many, many years, this COVID vaccine situation is obviously bringing the issue to the forefront more so. So the law basically says the employee only has to show that they have a sincerely held religious belief. And that's easy to determine if it's a religion, for example, that, is well known, a Protestant religion, a religion based in Jewish faith or tradition or Islamic tradition, some of the world's most recognized traditional religious beliefs. And so what an employer might do in that situation is they will provide us information, one that shows that you are actually a believer of this or follower of this particular religion, and then provide support that shows that we're either in religious literature or some other form that not being vaccinated is a part of the tenets of that particular religion or something associated with vaccinations or medical reasons or issues. If it's a religion that perhaps is not as well known or regarded as a traditional religion, the employer can't just on its own decide, oh, well, that's not a real religion, so we're not going to hear, what you have to say or take your exemption seriously. The employer, despite its own beliefs, still have to take the employee on its word initially that, one, they're part of this faith, that it's a part of a sincerely held belief of this faith, it's a part of the tenets of the faith, and then make a decision based on that determination. The employee can submit their own paperwork, and then it's encouraged that the employee will seek support from the religious leaders or others that can validate that what the employee is saying about the religion and is valid.
And I think there is some small sect which people who are anti-vaccination have used affiliation with that sect as an attempt to bolster the sincerely held religious belief part of this. But then there's the second part that you mentioned about undue burden on the employer's right to keep the workplace safe. So is that a case, even if you had an employee who cited this particular sect that was anti anti-vax, where an employer could still argue, but that still puts an undue burden on us in keeping the workplace safe.
Right. First and foremost, especially in this COVID-19 pandemic scenario, employers have a duty to create a healthy and safe work environment for everyone. So if accommodating any one employee based on either their disability or medical condition or their sincerely held religious beliefs places an undue burden on that employer, the employer can deny the request for reasonable accommodation and take the steps to enforce this mandated vaccine work environment. An undue burden could be to accommodate this one employee that you have to create an entirely different office or wing of the environment to make sure that that employee is safe and separated from other employees, or that perhaps the employee works in a job that's customer service interfacing and you need that employee in the workplace in order to do their job. So allowing them, for example, to work from home wouldn't quite work for that environment. That might be considered an undue or unreasonable burden of the employer. So it's really a case-by-case scenario. It's driven by how large an employer is, what the employer does as a part of its business, that particular employee's position. And really in this climate, the overall very high duty that's been placed on employers to create a safe and healthy work environment for all of its employees, as well as those customers and clients and so forth that it interfaces with.
We're talking with employment law specialist, attorney Angela Reddock-Wright of the Reddock Law Group. Also with us, Curtis Chang, co-founder of Christians and the Vaccine, a project that works with pastors and Christian leaders on the biblical principles that apply to vaccines. Curtis is also a senior fellow at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena and a consulting faculty member at Duke Divinity School. He recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "I'm a former pastor and I don't believe in religious exemptions to vaccine mandates." Curtis Chang, it's very good to have you with us on the program. First, are you aware of any essentially mainline major faith tradition where vaccines are urged against?
No, absolutely not. There is no creed, no scripture, no theological tradition within Christianity or frankly within any major religion that tells their believers they should not get vaccinated. In fact, the overwhelming consensus of established faith traditions and leaders is that Christians and other faith traditions should get vaccinated for themselves and for the sake of society. And just to give you a sense of how overwhelming the religious traditions point in this direction, if there was one religious sect, one denomination within the Christian tradition anyways, that you would expect to be coming out against vaccine mandates, Christian scientists that historically have been very hesitant on genuine religious grounds to take medical treatment for themselves. Yet even the Christian scientists have encouraged their members to get vaccinated. Why? Because they realize that this is not an issue just for themselves, for their own personal well-being. It affects the entire community. And here, the second greatest commandment of Christianity, given to us by Jesus, to love your neighbor as yourself, means we have to prioritize the health concerns and needs of our neighbor just as much as we do for our own personal individual proclivities or political beliefs or temperaments and so forth. And so it's so obvious from our statistics that we're seeing that getting vaccinated is an act of service, not just for ourselves, but even if you don't believe that, it is clearly an act of service for our neighbor, for our entire community. And this is why there is no legitimate religious exemption in play here. This is a mockery. This is an attempt by anti-vax folks to hijack religion, hijack Christianity, to justify essentially partisan and culture war positions. And this is why I'm calling on all people, whether you're Christians or not, and especially employers, to reject this mockery of religion and religious liberty.
Curtis, you're senior fellow at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, which is the country's largest non-denominational seminary, but it's evangelical, and it's really in many ways the intellectual center of American evangelicalism. And we know that a significant percentage of people who are anti-vaccination come from the evangelical tradition. Why do you think that is? I assume you are an evangelical.
It's because American evangelicalism is in the throes of a crisis where increasingly large segments of American evangelicalism, especially among white evangelicals, have essentially gotten swayed such that their politics and culture war positions are dominating their views on public issues much more than their faith convictions are. And so, there was a recent poll back in January by the National Association of Evangelicals, which polled their leadership circles and found that 95% of evangelical leaders in that poll were pro-vaccine. Right? That's in contrast to only 45% at that time of the base. So you have this split where pastors, leaders are pro-vaccine for the most part, with a few, exceptions that the press especially blows up, and those are the people who are, offering to fill out forms for folks and so forth. But the vast majority of evangelical pastors are pro-vaccine, but they are struggling to hold on to their base, which is, and I've had pastors tell me, like, look, Curtis, I get my congregation to shape their views for maybe like 45 minutes on Sunday. My congregation is listening to Tucker Carlson for 8 hours a week. And so they're bathing in this misinformation that's swirling around conservative media and social and online. And so pastors are struggling, to be quite honest, are struggling to shape their congregation's views on public issues of all sorts, but especially right now on the vaccine, and not let them be swayed by these outside forces that are swaying them to unbiblical stances.
How does this play out in Fuller, where you've got professors from this tradition, you've got students from around the world studying evangelicalism and theology and learning about social applications of Christian views in the world. So is this a significant issue that is under discussion at Fuller?
Well, I don't want to speak for Fuller. I'm a senior fellow there. I don't want to speak for the institution. I will say that the Fuller represents a tradition of evangelicalism that engages with science, engages with reason, that engages with biblical tradition in a responsible, thoughtful manner. And that stream of American evangelicalism, for the most part, has embraced and encouraged their followers to be vaccinated. And I want to say something here about how this issue is so clearly a mockery of evangelicalism and of religious belief. And this speaks to actually this whole question of how can you tell whether a religious belief is sincere? And this is, as your previous guest mentioned, is a critical issue for employers that might be listening are being put in this funny position of trying to have to determine, well, is this a sincere religious belief? I have a piece of advice for anybody listening that is going to be put in that situation. Here's a very simple, when you're engaging in that interactive process that your previous guest talked about, here's a very simple question to ask somebody asking for a religious exemption. Ask them, have they been vaccinated for measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, and so forth? Have they been vaccinated for that? Or have they been consistent in rejecting those vaccinations on religious grounds? Can they prove that they have rejected consistently all those other vaccinations for religious grounds? They're going to have a hard time proving that, because if it's an evangelical, even if it's a white evangelical that's claiming that their evangelical faith is telling them the vast majority of evangelicals, including white evangelicals, have been vaccinated. They have not consistently rejected vaccines on religious grounds. Right. There's a poll back in 2014 by the Pew Research Foundation that showed over 75% of white evangelicals, over 75% supported school mandates for the measles, mumps, rubella. Not just the vaccine itself, they supported mandates. They supported school mandates for the measles, mumps, rubella. So this is a mockery. This is an act of hypocrisy. This would be the equivalent of somebody who eats out at In-N-Out every day of the week showing up at their work cafeteria and meatloaf is on the menu, and they don't like meatloaf, so they're going to demand a vegetarian exemption and demand that they be served something else.
Curtis Chang, I need to break there, but I thank you so much for being with us, co-founder of Christians and the Vaccine, senior fellow at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, consulting faculty member at Duke Divinity, and writer of the op-ed in the New York Times recently. I'm a former pastor, and I don't believe in religious exemptions to vaccine mandates. And our thanks to our legal authority who joins us regularly on the program, Angela Reddock-Wright, based in Los Angeles. Let me just share a listener comment. This from Daniel.